Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'ina amma ba'd. So we had discussed in the previous session, we had discussed the need for spiritual struggle and what exactly is spiritual struggle. So he had discussed that. Now, there's a very important clarification he provides with regards to spiritual struggle, which is the need for moderation in spiritual struggle. Because some people, they get overexcited, they get very, very excited about struggle, or they think it's really, really something that you must do all the time. So then they start neglecting their duties. And sometimes they go overboard, so they get overwhelmed. And then that becomes actually harmful. So sometimes going overboard is actually a work of the shaitan, because his idea is that if you overdo it, you'll get tired, so you'll stop doing any kind of spiritual struggle. Happens to a lot of people. The burnout happens to a lot of people. So he says, this is on page 37 of the book that we're reading, The Path to Perfection. For some reason, it's showing us the other way around. Here, the purpose of spiritual struggle is not to depress and frustrate the lower self. So your nafs, it's not to make it frustrated, but to habituate the lower self to make effort. So you don't want to, this is like teaching students or something like that. If you're trying to train them, you don't want to get them frustrated that they think they can't achieve it, so then they just rebel and don't even want to study anymore. You want to do it so that you train them to be better. So it's the same with the nafs as well. So the purpose is to habituate and accustom the lower self to the effort, and to eliminate the habit of love for comfort and luxury all the time. For this purpose, that amount of spiritual struggle is sufficient, which brings some difficulty to bear upon the lower self. So it's saying that you need to do enough that it provides a bit of difficulty, not too much difficulty. Just a bit of difficulty. And if you don't have any difficulty at all, you can't improve, because for most people, mashallah, there are some people, like a minority, that they call them in Urdu Madarzad Wali, meaning that, I think that's what they call them. Basically, they've literally been born awliya. So they are just, mashallah, they are just totally predisposed, to this way, and to do good deeds, and they're always looking out for it, and you don't have to encourage them at all. You just need to tell them and they'll do something. And they always want to do it. They find it very easy. Unfortunately, that's a minority. For this purpose, that amount of spiritual struggle is sufficient, which brings some difficulty to bear upon the lower self. It is of no benefit to expose excessive strain on the lower self and frustrate it. Excessive strain will render it useless. Understand this well. Effort and trial are not always meritorious. The purpose is not the effort. That's just the means. Okay? Trials, difficulties, challenges are not the means. They're not by themselves rewarding, but the way you deal with them is what's rewarding. Now, if you're putting yourself under fitna, then that's wrong anyway. The Prophet ﷺ saw somebody standing up with a rope and helping him stand up with the rope. He said, what are you doing? Why are you doing that for? It is desirable if it is in moderation and resulting in beneficial progress. Excess in spiritual struggle is contemptible. Hence, observance of moderation is a must. Sheikh Sa'di al-Shirazi, may Allah have mercy on him, echoed this in the couplet, eat not so much that it spills from the mouth. You're stuffing your mouth and it's like all over the place. You've got so much food, you're trying to do this. Eat not so little that the body is overcome with weakness either. So you're eating so little you can't even survive. Recently somebody, and this is available everywhere, somebody just basically showed some of the problems with decadent culture, usually in the West. You've got this group of 5, 6 young men with bottles of beer. And the challenge is for all of them to drink like 10 bottles of beer or something. And what they're doing in this garden is they're all drinking, and then most of them are puking it out, but then they're drinking the rest, they're puking it out, they're literally just bellowing it out. And you're just wondering, there's ida'atul mal, it's haram, it's a miserable way of doing something, and it just shows. But I guess there's nobody to speak about that kind of decadence. It doesn't count as mal, but for them, they've spent money to get it. Now it's not mal anymore. For them, it's mal. For the Nasara, it is mal. Okay, Allah Most High says in the Holy Quran, in the Noble Quran actually, the servants of Allah are those who, when they spend, do not waste, nor become miserly. But between these extremes of waste and miserliness, they are moderate. Moderation is therefore to be observed in spiritual struggle, but this moderation should not be prescribed according to one's opinion and desire. The degree of moderation and the method of struggle should be taken from a spiritual master. Because if you're going to decide for yourself what's too much and what's too less without any experience, you're probably going to do if you're a person who's given to extreme, you're probably going to go extreme and thinking it's okay, I can do this. And there's some people, they're just literally killing themselves for nothing because they have a very harsh demeanor, right, about themselves. And there's some people which probably would be most people, they'll just be given to really relax, though I can't do that. So they'll do just a little bit. So it needs to be somebody, it needs to be like a prescription almost, that you go to the doctors, you go to your spiritual guide and say, this is what my issue is. So he tells you do something. After a week or two, you report back and say, this is what's going on. They should adjust accordingly. Okay, now, what are the types of spiritual struggle? There are two types of spiritual struggle. One is physical, and the second one is opposition. So physical is the imposition of practices upon the lower self in order to accustom it to difficulties. You put basically challenges, physical challenges to yourself, that I need to do this much extra nawafil, and so on. For example, accustoming the lower self to prayer by imposing upon it nafil prayers in abundance. I'm going to do 10 extra rakats a day. I'm going to do salat al-tasbih every day. I'm going to make sure I do my tahajjud every day. Or reducing the greed of the lower self by means of abundance of nafil fasts. The second type of spiritual struggle is opposition, which means to not do something that you would do, right? In this type of struggle, the lower self is opposing its desires. When the lower self urges one to commit a sin, opposition is offered. The main type of spiritual struggle is the second kind. That's the difficult one. The first one is even easier actually than the second one. To do extra nawafil is easier than to avoid things because the nafs is loving that thing. It's actually easier sometimes to force the nafs to do something than to not do something. Because usually to do something, there's also other elements of feeling accomplished, showing somebody else that I'm doing 10 extra rakats, or telling somebody that I've done 10 extra rakats. Whereas if you're abandoning something, which is usually a wrong, you don't really tell people that anyway. Except afterwards, alhamdulillah, Allah has given me the tawfiq to stop X, Y, and Z sins. So the first type is employed in order to actually attain the second type, the second kind. When the lower self becomes accustomed to difficulties, it will develop the habit of controlling its desires. You have to give it some difficulties. You can't expect, if somebody can't even pray once, until you don't undertake a difficulty, reschedule all of your work and everything, there's no way you can do salat 5 times a day. For that person, it's too much. But it's necessary, so there's no negotiation. When he's talking about spiritual struggle, he's talking about beyond the obligations. That's what he's saying. Those who possess the ability to control their desires without resorting to physical struggle, meaning the second type of physical struggle, are not in need of this first type of struggle. However, because such people are extremely few, because anybody who can avoid harams, do the second type, they actually don't need the first type either, because they'll probably find that very easy to do. They're most likely going to go in hand. If you can avoid harams, most likely you should be able to do good. I don't know if that's concomitant and necessary, but it seems so. But maybe in some cases you can avoid haram, but you don't feel like doing extra rakats of nawafil. But then that depends on why you're avoiding the haram. Is because it's just not available, or because you like it but you still can't get it? There's a lot of other possibilities here. But let's just take his word for it now. But then he says, as I said in the beginning, however, because such people are extremely few who have that kind of discipline, very few people, the Sufis have stringently adopted physical struggle as well. For most of their murids, they're going to say, you need to do it. According to the Sufis, physical spiritual struggle consists of 4 fundamental arkan. So that first category, it's usually made up of elements from these 4 categories, meaning the physical struggle. Number 1, qillatul ta'am, eating less. There's definitely a correlation between eating too much and the rise in passion, becoming lethargic, becoming heavy and weighty, becoming gassy, feeling less fresh. Aside from the type of food as well, which has an effect on the spirituality as well. Number 2 is qillatul kalam, because a lot of the physical things that we have to do is going to come from some things that we say. Some reactions could be caused, or a lot of the sins that we commit are going to be also from talking too much sometimes, which then becomes an abstinence. And number 3, qillatul manam, sleeping less. Sleeping less. When you sleep less, or you don't sleep on time, or you don't sleep in a routine, then usually the body needs sleep. Like essentially needs a routined sleep. If it doesn't, it goes off balance. And when the body goes off balance, usually the first thing you're going to avoid or stop doing are religious practices, because for us, they're nafil practices, optional practices. You're not going to miss your food, usually. Sometimes you do that as well if you're really, really tired. You don't want to eat, but sometimes eating actually helps you sleep. So sleeping less. When he says less here, it doesn't mean 3 hours a night. It just means don't go beyond I would say 7 to 8 hours. Don't go beyond there. Qillatul ikhtilat ma'al anam. Associating less with people, which is essentially decreasing your meeting with people, because that definitely creates a lot of room and excuses to do mistakes. One who fully acquires these 4 qualities and becomes accustomed to observe them will attain the ability to control their lower self. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't meet anybody at all and you become a recluse. It just means that wherever necessary, you're teaching a class. You do that. But you don't have to always hang out in a cafe or your friend's house, or call them over and just basically spend the whole time in discussing and gossip and wasting time and playing carom board and Monopoly and snooker and pool and computer games and whatever else there is, or watching something. He will be in a strong position to check the evil desires of the lower self. This is a remedy. You have to start with these 4. Spiritual struggle against the lower self is in its urge to sin is acquired when the lower self is opposed to a certain degree. You can never get control over yourself without opposing it first, because it wants to do whatever it wants to do. If we never oppose and let it do whatever it wants, then you can never tame it, even in its lawful desires. Meaning you have to oppose it sometimes even in its lawful desires, on excess. Refusal to fulfill immediately the desire of the lower self for some delicious food, for example, its urge for such food being rebutted and only fulfilled after vehement desire, so that the lower self does not become frustrated. So try to avoid it. But sometimes I know I want to have that burger. I want to have that cheesecake. I need to have that pizza. I'm getting frustrated. I can't think anymore. I won't be able to teach my class. I won't be able to sit in class properly and listen. I need to have that big, massive bottle of milkshake. Right? Okay, then finally go and give it up. Do it. Because slowly, the benefit is that you resisted for 2 hours. So next time you resist for 3 hours, inshallah, or 4 hours, and eventually you'll give it up. When one becomes accustomed to oppose the lower self in all things lawful, these are lawful things, right? To have chocolate, unless you say sugar's a poison, then I guess that's a different fatwa there, right? Because now there are people calling to say that eating sugary things is like smoking. But nobody says that because it's not the custom to say that yet. That'd be a different issue. Then it will become relatively simple to oppose the sinful urges of the lower self. A person who grants his lower self absolute freedom in lawful things will at times not be able to suppress the urge for sinning, because the car just goes. You can't help it. All right, so that's may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make that easy for us and strengthen us and assist us in this regard.
The point of a lecture is to encourage people to act, to get further, an inspiration, an encouragement, persuasion. The next step is to actually start learning seriously, to read books, to take on a subject of Islam and to understand all the subjects of Islam, at least at their basic level, so that we can become more aware of what our deen wants from us. And that's why we started Rayyan courses, so that you can actually take organized lectures on demand whenever you have free time, especially, for example, the Islamic Essentials course that we have on there, the Islamic Essentials Certificate, which you take 20 short modules, and at the end of that, inshallah, you will have gotten the basics of most of the most important topics in Islam, and you'll feel a lot more confident. You don't have to leave lectures behind. You can continue to leave, to listen to lectures, but you need to have this more sustained study as well. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.